A huge attack in the Moscow region and unrelenting strikes on its energy facilities. Ukraine is taking the war deeper into Russia. Russian oil refineries are burning and its ground offensive is stalling. So does Ukraine have the advantage at the moment? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. There appears to be a shift in the years-long conflict in Ukraine. Last weekend, Ukrainian forces struck deeper into Russian territory, piercing its air defences in a large strike on the Moscow region. This came a week after fears of a Ukrainian attack forced Russia to scale down its annual Victory Day parade. Kyiv's also been relentlessly striking Russia's oil facilities and military logistics as it tries to disrupt supplies to the front lines. All this as Russian missiles and drones continue to target sites across Ukraine. So where does the war stand in its fifth year? Does any one side have the upper hand? We'll put that to our panel of guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Felgenhauer.
This month, Ukraine has launched some of its most audacious attacks against Russia since the war began in 2022. A few days ago, it launched hundreds of drones and missiles. Some were intercepted, but many others hit their targets. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been touting Ukraine's growing long-range attack capability.
The distance to targets this time was more than 500 kilometers, which is significant because the Moscow region is the most saturated with Russian air defense assets. They protect their realm of power the most. But the Ukrainian long-range steppes are already overcoming this.
Ukraine has increased attacks against Russia's energy facilities on land and at sea. It's also been seeking to cut off Moscow's sources of funding. But Russia says the war will only end when major concessions are made.
For a ceasefire to happen and a corridor to open for full-scale peace talks, as the president already mentioned, President Zelensky must order the Ukrainian armed forces to cease fire and leave the territory of Donbas, leave the territory of the Russian regions.
The Russian leader himself recently said he believed the war was coming to an end. Remarks that came just hours after promising victory at Moscow's most scaled-back World War II victory parade in years. Ukraine says a change in strategy has helped it open up the battlefield to greater military gains. It says the new tactics have slowed down Moscow to its slowest advance rate since 2023. And longer-range drone attacks are at the center of it all. Officials say mid-range attacks have forced Russia to disperse air defenses away from the front lines. And after a winter of Russian attacks on its power network, Ukraine's military gains are being seen as a morale booster for its forces. Felgenhauer, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this with our guests who are joining us on today's Inside Story. And in Kyiv, we have Peter Zalmayev. He's director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a Russian foreign policy analyst. And in Washington, D.C., Mark Episkopos. He's research fellow at the Quincy Institute's Eurasia program. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Much of the world's attention, as you know, in recent months has not been on the war in Ukraine. Instead, it's been on Iran and the Middle East. If I start with you, Peter, do you think people have not noticed a change in dynamics and a change in Ukraine's tactics and targets? It seems Ukraine is now trying to take the war to Moscow.
Indeed, this is something what our former commander-in-chief, current Ukraine's ambassador to Britain, Valery Zaluzhny, said all along from the very beginning. The war needs to be brought to Russia and not just to some outlying areas, but to the main cities, such as the capital of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Ukraine has now reached that level of sophistication with its drone technology that it can actually do that. It's debatable, of course, whether those symbolic strikes on Moscow, some of them are symbolic, some of the strikes on like Tuapse, the areas where oil, is being refined, where there's a huge smoke that, will not go away for days. There's an environmental, damage done, but whether that really significantly damages Vladimir Putin's war machine, that's debatable. But the symbolism of it is unmistakable. Of course, we all know that from the very beginning of his rule, and especially with this war, Vladimir Putin has made this offer to the Russians: you stay out of politics, you'll have steady incomes, you'll stay out of, you don't criticize the war, you will stay at liberty, you will not go to jail. And we'll try to keep you as far away from the war if you live in Moscow or St. Petersburg as possible. You can live and not even feel this war. Right now, as we see from all the testimonies, video testimonies shot by Russian users of Telegram, other platforms that haven't been shut down in Russia yet, they're genuinely surprised that there's such a thing as the war. Ukrainians have been feeling it for years. Now it's the Russians who are feeling it. And, as you know, Financial Times is reporting that even Xi Jinping, at his meeting with Donald Trump, may have hinted that Vladimir Putin may rue the day, may regret his decision to start war with Ukraine.
Pavel, you heard there from Peter that he says people in Moscow are being unnerved by the situation. You are there in the Russian capital. Is that your experience? Ukraine has faced direct attacks on their capital since the first day of the Russian war, which Russia still calls a special military operation, back in February 24th, 2022, 4 and a bit years ago. Is it unnerving now for Muscovites that you're getting the same thing?
Well, Ukraine has now acquired capabilities it never had before. It's not only long-range drones, but also new Ukrainian-made cruise missile called Flamengo, and it's not only has a very large range, it has it's a cruise missile that carries a very heavy warhead, 1 ton. So that's not like a drone with 50 or 100 kilograms. That's very serious stuff. And Ukraine has been hitting targets deeper and deeper into Russia, and now there was one big major attack on Moscow that did get through in several places and hit some targets, Moscow region. And that's unnerving for the people in Moscow and for the Russian government, because this is the seat of the Russian government and they see themselves as being also under attack. And I'm afraid that we're looking right now to a major escalation of the entire war. What happened in the last part of the war in the Gulf in the 80s between Iraq and Iran, the so-called War of the Cities, when bloody gridlock on the front developed into this War of the Cities. Both nations were attacking each other's capitals increasingly. Of course, after
Pavel, let me stop you there. I mean, it's an interesting comparison. In fact, I was thinking about that comparison earlier on today when I was preparing for the programme. That was an 8-year-long war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. But I think what we have to remember is that war ended with stalemate. No one actually won, and there were 1 million people dead at the end.
Well, right now we're also in a bit of a stalemate, though Russia believes it's still advancing, and the Pentagon said Russia is advancing, and Moscow, the Kremlin, hoped that one more push, and by the fall, Ukrainian resistance will begin to crumble. But will that really happen? We can't say for sure. That depends on a number of factors, and we don't know them all. But what we do know is that both sides have now a capability to really make damage in each other's capital. And I'm afraid that's what they're going to do. There have been calls in Moscow, also from high officials like Sergei Mironov, former chair of the upper house of Federation Council, and now the leader of the Just Russia fraction in the Duma, and a friend of Putin who said that we should level the center of Kyiv, and that will end the war. We should destroy the center of Kyiv together with the Ukrainian leadership. And the Russian Defense Ministry this month was saying that also they can hit the center of Kyiv if Russia hits Moscow during the May 9th celebration. So people are talking about this war of the cities coming on, and like in the Chekhov play, most likely, if it's the gun on the wall is going to most likely fire. So that's what I'm afraid what we're facing right now, a major escalation of this war.
What do you make of that, Mark? It's a very worrying idea.
It is, and I'm afraid it's unfolding. We are entering a new escalatory stage of this war. The Russians launched 1,500 drones at Ukraine very recently. The Ukrainians have responded with this wave of drone attacks on Moscow region. I think the goal is twofold. There is an objective to make sure that Russia doesn't reap the windfall from rising energy prices as a result of the Iran war. And there was also a desire, as my fellow panelists said, to bring the war home to Moscow and to ensure that the war is more keenly felt by the average Russian as part of a strategy to pressure Putin into some kind of a war termination scenario. But the Russians can respond by upping the intensity, the frequency of their strikes even more, which leads us down a very dangerous situation, this kind of tit-for-tat game. The Russians still have tremendous airstrike capability. They have a capacity to inflict serious damage on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which is not such a big concern now in the summer, but could become more of a concern as we again enter winter season toward the end of this year. And they can also, apropos of the territorial issue, which is one of the main issues holding up a negotiated settlement, the Russians find it difficult to advance in Donetsk because of the kill zones and the gray zones and the way that this war has been waged. But what they can do, I'm afraid, is to make a crater out of that part of Donetsk. They can level the place if they conclude, and they very well may conclude toward the end of this year, that a settlement is unattainable.
I noticed, Peter, that Russia has now launched a 3-day nuclear exercise involving lots of troops and missile launches along with Belarus. I'm not suggesting Russia is planning any sort of nuclear attack, but what do you make of what Pavel and Mark have said about Russia having the capability, if it wanted, and of course there would be the effect on world opinion, but to flatten parts of Ukraine, including potentially parts of Kyiv?
Well, I think that they had wanted to do it all along. I mean, this desire to go after cities, it was articulated early in the war by the likes of Mr. Solovyov, Vladimir Solovyov, who is a major and very influential TV anchor, who said, I think in the first few months that, oh my gosh, we're going to have to go and bomb cities. So this has been floating around, and I think, and not for a lack of desire, but I think that, the capabilities, I don't think it's automatic. Putin decides to press the button and the cities will be flattened. They would have done it a long time ago. Instead, we're hearing again this iteration of nuclear blackmail. We once again saw it early on during the first few months of the war, when the Russian offensive started stalling pretty dramatically. The Russians had to withdraw their troops from around Kyiv and the Kyiv region, and now that they're bogged down again, we're hearing a repeat of this. Once again, there is a logic to it. And when it comes to Belarus, another scare tactic. If Lukashenko hasn't entered into this war in the last 4 years, why would he do so now? He knows that his army's days and his industry's days are numbered if he decides to do that. They're all within striking distance of Ukrainian drones, and he knows that this will be his last and very ill-fated decision if he decides to do more than what he's already done. He's been an accomplice to this war, but whether he will send his troops to fight in it, I seriously doubt it.
Pavel, any war is a military war, but also an information war, and the battle for world opinion and opinion in Ukraine and in Russia. How worried will they be in the Kremlin by the idea that Russia is now unable effectively to defend its own capital city, and the pictures that we all saw of the Victory Day parade so subdued this year?
Yes, that's politically very, very bad for the present Russian government and for President Putin personally. There can be a reaction to that, and that could be rather unpleasant. There's also growing rhetoric right now. Just today, there was a Ukrainian drone shot down by a Romanian fighter over Estonia. Straight into Estonian territory and was shot down. And the same day, the Russian SVR intelligence service accused the Baltic states of aiding and abetting and harboring, actually getting ready to send Ukrainian drones from their territory. So there's also not only a possible escalation between Moscow and Kyiv, there could be at least threats of pulling in other countries, escalating the war geographically to maybe include Russian possible attacks on the territory of Ukrainian allies in Europe. I don't think that is imminent at all, but the rhetoric is going to be more and more severe as the situation becomes increasingly politically untenable for the Kremlin.
Mark, can I ask you about some of the recent targets that Ukraine has chosen? This big attack, the 16th to 17th of May, a semiconductor plant and numerous facilities related to Russia's oil infrastructure, oil and energy infrastructure. These were quite deliberately chosen, were they not?
Indeed, it's part of a concerted attempt to deprive Russia of energy profits at a time when energy prices are spiking across the world. It is a very serious concern among Ukrainian officials that Russia will greatly enrich itself and fill its war coffers. And we are seeing a real effect of these Ukrainian strikes over time. The problem is, you have a drone attack on some oil refinery in some part of Russia, and that knocks the facility out for a couple of weeks, but then the Russians repair it, it goes back online, and business as usual goes on. So the challenge for Ukraine is to sustain these attacks and to conduct what's being called double tap attacks, right? To attack a specific place and then to attack it again in short order to keep that facility offline. So the Ukrainians have demonstrated with this recent wave of strikes a real capability to target sites inside Russia, both in the Moscow region, but also more broadly. And the Russians are continually racing to counteract the effects of these Ukrainian strikes. We've had, unfortunately, tragically, this war has been a hotbed of military innovation in drone tactics and counter tactics, and I fully expect that to continue.
Peter, you heard there what Mark said. To add to what Mark said, President Zelensky has said the recent attacks in the Moscow region were entirely justified. He described them as long-range sanctions. As Mark said there, quite deliberately, they know that there is a windfall potentially for Russia because of the other war in the Middle East, and Ukraine is trying to make sure Russia doesn't get most of that money. That's the tactic, is it not?
Well, not necessarily when it comes to Moscow. Moscow, once again, is a symbolic target, and it may be justified as such. I wouldn't be, eager to say that whatever civilians' deaths are justified in either case. There is, I guess, some justice on the part of that Ukrainians feel that it's a tit for tat thing. If Ukrainian civilians have been dying by the droves every day of this war, why not the Russians? Well, that will probably not allow Ukraine to achieve any strategic goals. So there is a debate going on whether Ukraine's increasing but still limited resources should be used against the symbolic targets of Moscow in civilian areas, whether those victims happen by by accident or not, or they should concentrate on oil refineries, targets much less visible, or not always as visible, not always as felt in the capitals, but at the end of the day, more effective in grinding down Vladimir Putin's war machine. Whether Ukraine will achieve the capability to be doing both at once, that remains to be seen.
Pavel, I mean, today's programme, I think, is showing that Ukraine no longer feels on the back foot. But is there a danger in taking a snapshot at a moment like this? Because you could have taken a snapshot at various points in the last 4.5 years and sometimes come up with the idea that Russia was ahead and sometimes that Ukraine was advancing. Things in this war suddenly switch, don't they?
Well, to some extent, yes, but strategically it's still a stalemate, more or less. And Ukrainian attacks are spectacular in recent weeks or months, but even in oil capacity production and oil refinery, they can have capped 10% of Russian oil refinery capability. It's not that Russia is going to fall because of these attacks. They're more psychological in nature than practical. There are also Ukrainian attacks on key Russian military and electronics installations that could be more important. But again, Russia has the capacity to rebuild and reboot, which means that both countries are going to do that. Russia is also trying to knock out Ukrainian drone production, but Ukrainian drone production is growing. And that Russia is hoping also that America will put pressure, Trump will put pressure on Ukraine and that they'll retreat from the Donbass. But it doesn't seem that Washington has that capability. Trump kind of stepped away to a large extent from Ukraine, and now he doesn't have all that influence to push Ukraine to do what they don't want to do. So this is, again, it's a quagmire, a very bloody quagmire, and it doesn't seem to have a swift way out.
So, Mark, where things stand at the moment, there was a lot of push from the US throughout 2025 for diplomacy. Do you see any opening for diplomacy, given that it was the US that was leading the diplomatic efforts, given that the Trump administration is, at the moment, bogged down with what's going on in Iran and the Middle East?
Well, there was a big push, and I would argue that there still is. I would quibble with the idea that the administration has stepped away from the Ukraine negotiations. I think there is still a real process, a real impetus behind this diplomatic push to end the war. Anyone familiar with the talks can tell you that issues are being discussed. The gap is being slowly narrowed on many key issues. The security guarantees package for Ukraine is virtually finalized. The territorial issue remains the big sticking point. But look, I mean, has there been a lull in the negotiations? Of course. You have the same cast of characters, people like Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, who now have to deal with this new crisis. And unlike Ukraine, this is a war that the United States is waging directly. And it's a war with much greater immediate implications for global markets and the like, if you look at the Hormuz Strait situation. So, of course, inordinate resources are going to be devoted to Iran. Now, are those resources being devoted at the expense of the Ukraine peace process? I'm not so sure about that. I think there is a real push to settle this war before the midterms, because things will get both politically but also militarily more difficult after that point, as far as the administration is concerned. And I think the White House, I mean, this is a signature campaign issue for President Trump, and this would be a real feather in his cap to tell voters in November that this is a promise made and a promise kept.
On that point, Peter, on the possible diplomacy, obviously President Trump has had his problems with President Zelensky. We remember what happened in the Oval Office when he and Vice President Vance berated Zelensky. They've had a difficult relationship. Do you think that Ukraine perhaps can persuade the transactional Trump to look at this differently, to show that perhaps Ukraine is no longer the loser that needs rescuing, but the country with its innovative drone operation that actually the US should embrace?
Well, he has done that. He has fluctuated in his rhetoric. If you remember, first, of course, he berated Zelensky for not having enough cards or having no cards. And then he actually turned around and said, Ukraine can actually win this war. So he turns on a dime. He changes it rhetoric 180%. I think deep down, first of all, there's a resentment in that Ukrainians and Zelensky himself, Donald Trump thinks, were involved in the, matters leading to his impeachment in Congress during his first term. And second, we don't know all of the details about the negotiations that are happening behind the scenes between his emissaries, who are businessmen, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Steven Witkoff, his former real estate partner, and whatever the Russians, Mr. Dmitriev and others, may be promising them, how they may be sweetening the deals. And we know that the Donald Trump administration has not been averse to receiving what some would consider bribes from various governments, including in the Middle East and others. And so this may be a calculation, and this is something the Russians can do much better. They can afford it much better than the Ukrainians, let's face it. So I think that, I would be very skeptical on that score. I suspect that Donald Trump will never be Ukraine's ally.
I want to quickly bring in Pavel at the end on that point. Very quickly, Pavel, how much do you think the outcome actually, despite this awful war that's been going on, does depend on the whims of the man in the White House?
Well, there was hope in Moscow that Trump would order the Ukrainians to surrender and that they'll concede. That didn't happen. And so right now, they say in the Kremlin, there's no sense to continue negotiation. It's going to be decided, apparently, on the battlefield. So Russia is ready to accept the Ukrainian surrender, but if they don't, well, we'll push on. So that's the bottom line.
Thank you very much to our guests today, Peter Zalmayev, Pavel Felgenhauer and Mark Episkopos. There's so much more on this subject. If you want further context and analysis, it's available on our website, aljazeera.com, or on our app on your tablet or phone. As ever, we invite your comments on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or tell us what you think on X. Tag us. We are at AJ Inside Story. That's it from this studio and from me, James Bays, and the team for now. But stay tuned because Al Jazeera's global coverage continues in just a moment.